There we go. All right, welcome. So, excuse me. So we're going to be talking about the Eastern Mediterranean, an area that is really intensely fascinating. A lot going on in the area in terms of both sort of modern international grape varieties, as well as a lot of indigenous grapes that the countries are really beginning to embrace again after sort of turning to international styles of wine for a period of time. So we have an extremely ancient history. This is an area that has been a crossroads of civilization for such an incredibly long time and really shaped the history of the world as well, which is really interesting. Although we have this sort of ancient history, the winemakers are trained in a very modern style. They have flown abroad. They've trained in places like France, excuse me, UC Davis. We've gone to places like Australia, South Africa, New Zealand. What do a lot of these places have in common? They're also warmer regions. We talk about Mediterranean climate. So as we talk about these areas as well, we're certainly going to discuss the climate, but I think we can kind of get that out of the way to begin with, right? So like I always like to do, I like to paint kind of a broad picture of the area that we're discussing. How can we link these areas together? And then how can we learn what sets them apart, right? So we already know we're in the Eastern Mediterranean. Even if we knew nothing about wine, we would imagine that that gives us a Mediterranean-like climate, right? Especially in the areas that are closer to the coast. Now, when we talk about Turkey, we're talking about a pretty large country. So you might assume, and you would be right, that the wine growing regions that are situated closer to the coast are more Mediterranean. While if you have inland wine growing areas, we'd be talking about a more continental climate. Absolutely. The island of Cyprus, we're talking Mediterranean, right? Mediterranean, completely surrounded on all sides. We're going to talk about Lebanon today. It's such a narrow country. We're certainly also thinking about a Mediterranean climate that really impacts a lot of the country, as well as in Israel. But we really will talk about some of those mountain ranges that sort of bisect or run parallel to the coast and create these valleys of areas that we can discuss for grape growing and viticulture, right? Now, there's a lot of other areas that are really interesting. We'll talk a little bit about Palestine when we get to Israel as well, because there are Christian Palestinian wineries that are really cool, I think, personally. But Syria does have a burgeoning wine region, but unfortunately they've had a civil war for 10 years now, I think, almost. That wine industry really is quite small. Jordan's industry is small, as well as Egypt. And I think one of the other interesting concepts that we talk about is, unlike somewhere like Western Europe or in the New World, we're primarily discussing countries here that that don't always necessarily have citizens who drink alcohol, right? We have a lot of Islam in the area, and the religion itself typically forbids the consumption of alcohol. So, but we do have these wine industries, which is really fantastic. So let's just dive right in. What should we talk about first? So first, we're going to discuss Israel. We have a huge, very long recorded history of wine. It is well documented in the ancient texts. Genesis references Noah's planting of a vineyard following the recession of the Great Flood. Moses receives a cluster of grapes, part of the vinous bounty of the Promised Land. And a lot of these archaeological findings verify the viticultural reports that we have in these stories. And there's an abundant evidence of ancient winemaking throughout these regions in the Eastern Mediterranean. In 70 Common Era, Romans invade Jerusalem and the Second Temple, and this disperses the Jewish population and some of the viticultural knowledge that already exists within the region. Many of these areas we're talking about sort of the cradle of the first winemaking, right? We'll get to that with Turkey and Lebanon too. In the mid 7th century, Arab conquest further suppressed winemaking in the area. In the 19th century, Jews began to return from the diaspora, and winemaking reemerges in Ottoman-controlled Palestine during this time. Through much of this, a lot of this was home winemaking, but in the walled city of Old Jerusalem, they counted 26 wineries within its boundaries, which is pretty cool. And 2 of those still produce wine today. And they showed that even then, both French and indigenous grape varieties were used. So we have a big French influence, especially if we talk about places like Lebanon as well. In the 1880s, Baron Edmund de Rothschild invested in an Israeli winery. So this brings a lot of advancements. He brought his own cuttings from Lafitte, the winery that he owned in Bordeaux. And this was really the birth of the modern Israeli wine industry. So the winery that he built still operates today and is known as Carmel. In 1983, the Golan Heights winery was founded. Carmel and Golan Heights today remain 2 of the largest wineries in Israel. And the Golan Heights winery really ushered in this kind of new era of very modern winemaking. In the 90s, we began to see more of the sort of boutique wineries that are formed during this time. Marguerite, Domaine du Castel are both founded. And although I would say certainly in the 80s and 90s, we had a really big influence, and still today, a big influence of these French grape varieties and international grape varieties, we're really beginning to see a resurgence of indigenous grapes. And I think we'll see that in every country we're going to talk about today, which is pretty interesting. Here on the right, you see this is a Byzantine press that was uncovered as well. So when we talk about grape varieties today, you're going to hear a lot of the same until we get to the indigenous grapes of each country. But I think that, again, it's one of those tidbits of knowledge that really help shape our understanding of this region, right? So we already mentioned that the grape varieties in Israel really rely on a core of these kind of classic French and international grape varieties. And a lot of these were brought by the Baron Edmund de Rothschild when he came in the 1880s. I think he originally came, he was hired to help build the railroad within the area. So the Bordeaux and Rhone grapes, as you can imagine, think about the characteristics of these grape varieties. Is Bordeaux a warm Mediterranean climate? We know that it's not, but we know that those grapes can do well in those type of climates, right? So Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, we talk about Rhone grape varieties like Shiraz. We call it usually in Israel, we see it usually listed as Shiraz. I would say the same thing that I oftentimes say for places like Australia or California. When you see Shiraz, the winemaker is probably telling you that it's made in that riper, more bombastic, richer style. If you see a producer in Israel using Syrah, that's probably their homage to more of a French Northern Rhone style of Syrah, maybe a little bit more restrained, focusing more on that flower and black pepper characteristic, and not as much on fruit, and maybe not seeing as much new oak. Carignan, Mourvedre, of course, Cinsault, which we're going to talk about tonight. Argauman is a really interesting grape variety as well, developed in the 1970s. It's a crossing of Carignan and Cinsault, and it was really kind of developed the workhouse variety. They wanted something that could withstand the elements while still giving good yield, and most importantly, a lot of color. Color was seen as a quality attribute to wine during this time. But today, just like things like Carignan as well, this grape is really seeing a resurgence for quality-minded producers who are keeping the yield down and being careful about how they make the wine. So we're seeing Argauman a lot more often, and it's really unique too because it's sort of a Israeli grape variety, right? Like it's not an indigenous grape variety, it's a crossing, but almost like Pinotage is to South Africa, Argauman is to Israel, which is pretty cool. Cinsault is a Portuguese grape variety. We see Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, Viognier are really popular. They do prefer sort of these aromatic grape varieties, I find, when it comes to the white wine. You can find quality examples of Riesling and Gewürztraminer when they're grown in cooler sites. And then we're beginning to really identify a lot of native grapes. And while we're still looking to identify some of these grapes, the whites like Morawi, which tend to be a little bit on the almost like a Chardonnay-esque side, I would say, but it's a really bright and pretty and lifted. Dabuki, Jindali, Baladi, Asmar, Batuni. These are all indigenous grape varieties that we've found. And then we're still, as I mentioned, really looking to identify these other native grapes. So you're seeing a lot of producers, especially these sort of boutique wineries, who are now producing both international styled wines and then indigenous grapes as well. Now, kosher wine is something that, to me, I don't know a lot about it. And so I wanted to say at the beginning of this, two things that I missed. One is that I mentioned things that all these countries have in common. The other thing I forgot to mention about that is they all kind of struggle against the elements, right? When we are talking about a warmer Mediterranean climate, we do have humidity closer to the coast. So a lot of what we do in these countries is finding ways to grow quality grapes despite the elements, right? The other thing I wanted to say was these are not native languages to me. I didn't grow up around these languages. So sometimes when I mistakenly mispronounce words, I just want to apologize. All right, cool. So kosher wine, as I was mentioning, fundamental to the industry, just like we say with so many other, in a way, process-driven wines, although I don't think kosher wine is not a process-driven wine, it's just wine. It's fundamental to the industry here. Not all Israeli wine is kosher, and not all kosher wine is Israeli. So kosher wine may be made in any wine growing region in the world. So you have kosher wine coming from Germany and France and California and anywhere in the world that you can make wine, you can make kosher wine. Just like biodynamics and organics, there are multiple kosher certifications that somebody might choose to seek out. But the idea behind kosher wine, the foundational principle, is that once the grapes are harvested, the grapes and wine are to be handled only by Sabbath observing Jews. So because of that, a lot of the winemaking in the winery does need to be automated because the kind of physical process of winemaking cannot occur on the Sabbath. So if you have wines that need to be punched down or wines that need to be racked or many other things, you would have to make sure that this is mechanized. All additives like fining agents, yeast, cleaning materials have to be kosher certified, and you cannot use animal products. So that means that kosher wines are vegan, which I think is a really a unique idea that you can share that with someone who might specifically be seeking out vegan wines. And maybe they don't specifically seek out kosher wine, but if they're at a wine shop and they really need to have something that's vegan, and somebody, maybe the salesperson isn't sure, I don't know all the vegan status of all of the wines on our list, certainly, because sometimes that information is just not shared. I think it's interesting that somebody could choose to have a kosher wine and you would know that that is a vegan wine. They can't grow other crops between the vine rows. They must wait until the fourth harvest of a new vineyard to make wine from it. And then there's the ceremonial kind of tithing of the percentage of each year's wine as well. Mavushal is the most stringent kosher certification, and this does, and a lot of people think that this is true for all kosher wine, but it's not. It's just the Mavushal wine does require flash pasteurization as well. So let's talk about regions. So one of the other things that a lot of these regions or countries that we're talking about today have in common is that they don't have formal appellation systems. Many of them have regions that they, of the area, a name of the area that they call their wines after. So Israel is also you know what, Bekaa, I'm seeing your question. I don't know why that is, but for some, I don't know if it's a kind of a quality-minded thing or if it has something to do, but I don't know the answer to that question, unfortunately. So we think of Israel as a desert often, and the southern part, the Negev desert, of course, is. As you get further south, it tends to become drier. And as you go further east toward Jordan, it certainly tends to become warmer. But because of these mountain ranges, there is, of course, even a small country, a diversity of climates for viticulture. So let's look at some of the kind of the top winemaking regions. So the Golan Heights are located in the northeast corner, so overlooking both Syria and Lebanon here to the north. So it'd be to the east and the north here. Sits on top of all volcanic plateaus. So high elevation, you see tufa and basalt. There are 3 subregions of Southern Golan, the Middle Golan, very clever names here, and the Upper Golan. And the attention is primarily focused in the high altitude vineyards of the Upper Golan. And this is where we've seen a lot of since the 1990s, a lot of the country's sort of quality revolution had been driven from this area. Carmel Winery is right up here, the very top, tippy kind of top of the Central Mountain region. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Galilee, also one of the larger wine regions, divided into 2 sectors. So we have Upper Galilee. This tends to be a little bit more on the higher elevation, volcanic and terra rossa soils as well. A lot of hills in this area. The Lower Galilee is not quite as quality minded for viticulture as the upper. 200 to 400 meters, but also on volcanic and limestone soils as well near Mount Tabor. As we move into the Central Mountain, which you can see, so Golan Heights, Galilee, the upper and the lower, the Central Mountains, they really cross Israel, right? The Dead Sea from Haifa to the Dead Sea. They encompass Mount Carmel, Menashe Hill, Shamron Hill, the Judean Hill, one of the top areas for viticulture within Israel as well. This was one of the first regions where you really saw the Rothschilds plant their vineyards in the 1880s. So as I mentioned, Carmel Winery is located kind of up here in this little tippy-toppy of this spot. We see a lot of calcareous clay, limestone, chalk, a big sort of mix of soils that are very advantageous to viticulture in this area. The coastal plain, it's pretty humid. It's a lot warmer. We think of the coastal plain as being, along with the Central Mountain, primarily you see a lot more of the kind of larger wineries located within the Central Mountain, but the coastal plain is known more for bulk wine or bulk grape growing production. So they have a lot of fruit, citrus, strawberries, our alluvial soil, not quite as high quality for grape growing, a lot of humidity within this area that needs to be mitigated as well. Judean foothills, as we mentioned, so located sort of right here in the center, so kind of right on the west bank. So part of the Judean foothills also belongs to Palestine, and there are Christian Palestine that do make wine. The majority of wine producers within Palestine are like local monasteries and churches that do produce the wine. The main one is called, I forget, I wrote it down because I knew I would forget somewhere on my notes. I'll come up with it later, the main Palestinian winery, but I wrote it down. I can bring it for you later. A lot of the vineyards are found in this area. Nearly a third of all of Israel's vineyards are in this small area of the Judean foothills. So very concentrated plantings of vines within this area. We have a lot of diurnal fluctuations, kind of offset of these warm daily temperatures. We have the cooling winds that come from the Mediterranean Sea. We have a lot of variance in altitude within this area, 300 to 1,000 meters as well, but a lot of small plots here. Terra rossa topsoil on the limestone bedrock. The Negev highlands in the south. So the Negev region is pretty large, but we have the desert area. We have the Negev highland, which is a little bit closer to the coast than a lot of the rest of the desert here. And this part of this desert that's making up nearly half of the country. So also a high elevation area up to 900 meters. We have sandier soil in this area, but the fog that comes in and blankets the vineyards in the early morning and that diurnal shift that you're seeing really helps the production of grapes here. And really, I haven't really found that there's a lot of distinction in where we grow the grapevine. So that's something else that I think is kind of interesting about these regions on the Eastern Mediterranean. Is, you know, it's not like we talk about like the Central Mountains are only for Cabernet, and then the coastal plains are only, I was thinking that maybe the coastal plains would be better for like things like Chenin Blanc and Chardonnay or things like that, but it's just not really the case. We do see when we start, start talking about some of the indigenous grape varieties of Lebanon, we'll see that some of them do better in the mountain vineyards as well. So Lebanon, we talk about the Phoenicians all the time in the history of the wine world, right? And this is no exception. Ancient Phoenicia, the boundaries roughly equated modern Lebanon, northern Israel, and southern Syria. And it's widely credited not for just being the birthplace of wine. We think it might be one of the birthplaces of wine, although it's kind of a hotly contested subject, right? Is it Georgia? Is it Lebanon? Is it Turkey? But one thing that we kind of agree on is that the Phoenicians invented the commercial wine trade. They took the grapevine, they were great maritime traders, they sailed around the Mediterranean, and they had a huge hand in spreading the vine and in the commercial wine trade as well. They founded a lot of the kind of southern Mediterranean port cities of North Africa, the Greek islands, Sicily, Cadiz, and Spain as well. They shared the vine cuttings and winemaking knowledge around their trade routes, and the classic regions like the Sherry Triangle were first planted by Phoenicians as well. So vines really flourished in what today is present-day Lebanon, even following the decline of Phoenicia in the 6th century before the Common Era. In the 3rd century Common Era, Romans erected a temple to Bacchus, and today this is still a UNESCO World Heritage Site that you can go see within Lebanon as well. Throughout the Middle Ages, the wines were extremely popular in places like Europe and traded by Venetian merchants. And, you know, we've talked a little bit about the Venetian merchants when we've talked about the Greek islands, places like, not Sicily, but places like Santorini and Crete, where you saw a lot of Venetian merchants that also sailed around the Mediterranean and traded wines. We'll talk a little bit about them when we get to Cyprus as well. The Ottoman Empire expanded into Lebanon in 1517. They forbade the consumption of alcohol. You know, in some places, the Ottoman Empire would not really forbid the practice of winemaking or of growing grapes, but they would forbid the consumption of alcohol, right? So if nobody's drinking, what's the point of making wine? But during these times, a lot of local Christian populations are able to continue to make wine because of for religious purposes, and this helps the art of viticulture stay alive during these times. In 1857, Jesuit missionaries established Chateau Cassara, which is today Lebanon's largest producer, so quite an important one to know. 1868, Domaine de Tourelles is founded by Francois Eugene Brune, one of the wines we're enjoying tonight. And winemaking knowledge here too, it's really interesting. A lot of it was adopted from French Algeria, and there's a really big French influence that's still apparent in the Eastern Mediterranean today, particularly in Lebanon. This really impacts a lot of both the winemaking and the wine drinking culture as well. I think Arabic is the main or the first language of Lebanon, but both French and English are well spoken here as well. In 1943, Lebanon declared independence, and in 1975, at the beginning of the Lebanese Civil War. So during this time, there were 4 wineries in 1975 when the Civil War breaks out: Chateau Cassara, Chateau Moussar, Domaine de Tourelles, and Chateau Naka. And the wine was produced during the conflict, but the market was so turbulent, the domestic market, that it really inhibited the growth. And prior to this time, there was not a lot of export of the wines of Lebanon already. So there was not really anywhere for these wines to go. So most of these wineries produced wine during the war. You know Chateau Moussar, who is really kind of one of the most singular styles of winemaking in the world, right? The Chateau Moussar wines are so endlessly fascinating, whether you like them or you don't. But it was really Serge Hokar who saw the need to establish an export market. He was making wine. He only missed 2 vintages during the war. He was making this wine, and he needed to be able to sell it somewhere. So in 1979, he went to Bristol Wine Fair, and Michael Broadbent, the very important critic and auctioneer, found the wines, and they were highly praised. So, we think of Moussard being kind of like the epitome of Lebanese wine, but what they really did well was that they brought their wine to an international market when there were not a lot of other producers that had done so before. And I even think like Chateau Cassara, like I don't see those wines in the United States. Maybe they are here. I do see the Domaine des Tourelles, of course, because I love the wines. I think they're so fantastic. But Moussard, you see everywhere. Every som knows it. Every restaurant does have or has had it on their list at some time, right? Something that we've done by the glass can be really, really exciting. The war ends in 1990, and post this time, we see a lot of exponential growth. So from 4 wineries to 35 in 2010. And today we see more than 50. One of my favorite small wineries, and I didn't put it in the slides here, but they're called Sept, S-E-P-T, and they make really fantastic, mostly Rhone style wines. They're working with Syrah, Grenache. They even do some stuff, I think, with like Roussanne Marsanne, and then also the indigenous white grapes, which we'll talk about too. So in Lebanon, we don't have a formal appellation system, but Lebanese wine is really synonymous with an area known as the Bekaa Valley. So the majority of wine that you will see exported is coming out of the Bekaa. This is really interesting that they haven't established this sort of formal appellation system, because there are wineries that are not located in the Bekaa or have grapes that are not coming from the Bekaa that are calling their wineries Bekaa Valley. And this not only hurts the consumer. If we understand that the Bekaa Valley is supposed to be the highest quality region for the growing of grapes in Lebanon, it hurts us as consumers, but it hurts the producers too, right? So the producers that are making their wine in the Bekaa Valley, the name of that region is not protected. So I would expect that would change in the future as well. So wines grown outside the region are bearing the Bekaa Valley name. The valley that rests between the Mount Lebanon range rises up from the Mediterranean coast and the anti-Lebanon mountains, which form kind of the edge of the Syrian border. And they begin at the top of the Golan Heights. So a better map is this bottom one, where you would see, the Golan Heights would be right up over here, right? So you see the anti-Lebanon range, you can't see on this map, but it's forming the border with Syria coming up this way. And then the Litani River is running through this area. So this whole area itself is known as the Bekaa, but the valley itself is actually quite small. There's a more kind of western area that's more sort of in the south, kind of southwestern area of the Bekaa. It's considered to be the best quality. It's a little bit cooler, it's slightly wetter here. Something that is important is a lot of these vines are dry farmed. Not everything that's here is dry farmed, but we can dry farm some because we're kind of barricaded from the heat of the desert in Syria. So that's important. But also the water table in the Bekaa is really high. So if you have old vines, if they've been established correctly, the root can grow down and access that water table as well. Batroun is a northern coastal city that's recently been seeing a lot of producers establish themselves up here in the north as well. So let's talk about some grape varieties. Bordeaux, Rhone, other French varieties. These are the most common, just like Israel. I mean, in Israel, we're seeing Cabernet Sauvignon is still Cabernet Sauvignon. It's grown a lot there. It has a lot of play in the market as well. We're seeing that here in Lebanon too. Chateau Moussard is mostly Cabernet Sauvignon, right? When we talk about the red wine. Domaine des Tourelles, they also do Cabernet Sauvignon. Most producers are sort of banking on these Bordeaux grape varieties. Again, Rhone varieties are beginning to see a lot of an uptick in terms of, in both Israel and Lebanon. Producers are becoming more interested in blends as opposed to just a single varietal wine. And I see both in Lebanon and Israel a lot of that experimentation of maybe blending non-traditional grape varieties, especially if they're French. So just like we're seeing, with places like Penfolds in Australia, you do see producers that are doing sort of the Cabernet Sauvignon Syrah style blend. And then you see producers doing a lot of Rhone style blend. So Syrah, Mourvedre, Grenache is important here as well. We're talking about that Mediterranean climate, right? We also see grapes like Viognier, Chardonnay, Sauvignon Blanc, Semillon, also really important, both here and in Israel as well. And then the two white grape varieties that are indigenous to Lebanon. They're really the most notable indigenous varieties. They were mistaken for a long time and thought to be Chardonnay and Semillon. Obide kind of had this Chardonnay-esque characteristic to it, a little bit of a richer texture, more of the kind of orchard fruit characteristic. And Merlot can be a little bit more Semillon-esque, have more of that slightly waxy texture on the palate, but both fairly more neutral grape varieties. You can see them vinified either in stainless steel, concrete, you see oak, we're seeing all sorts of different kind of fun examples. And I think too, that's another interesting, without so much of a formal appellation system, and it's more New World, right? If they have an appellation system, it's more New World in terms of its approach, where they're sort of just defining the geographical areas without telling you about what you have to plant and how you have to make the wine in each area. A little bit different in Cyprus, but we'll talk about that when we get there. So Obide and Merlot do better in the mountain vineyards. They don't do as well in the valley of the Bekaa. Most of Lebanon wineries also produce arak. So if you're heading to Lebanon, it's an unsweetened grape-derived spirit. It undergoes multiple distillations, usually between 2 to 4 in a Moorish copper still. But most importantly, that distillation happens with anise seed. So it has that kind of fennel, anise, licorice, black jelly bean characteristic to it. Like a lot of spirits that are made with anise seed, it does louche when you add water to it. So it's the most common way to enjoy it, to cut 1 part arak with 2 parts water. Gives it a cloudy appearance. And so almost every winery that you will find, Chateau Moussard makes arak. Domaine des Tourelles makes arak. Very, very important traditional beverage of Lebanon. All right, Cyprus. Huge, huge history here. Located between the Middle East and Europe. Been conquered by so many civilizations throughout history. It's controlled at various times by the Greeks, the Romans, Egyptians, Phoenicians, Assyrians, of course, the Ottomans. Fell under Byzantine rule until the late 12th century Crusades. It was held by the Venetians for a time. It was even ceded to Great Britain in 1878. So a lot of different changes going on in this area. In 1960, they gained independence, but the northeastern sector of the island had been under Turkish occupation since 1974. You probably know about this. Every now and then you see it in the news, but it's been since 1974. So it's kind of the northeastern sector of the island. We'll see a map. They joined the EU in 2004. They're also part of the Eurozone as well. But what's really fascinating is that they are believed to vinify the world's oldest continually produced named wine, which is Commanderia. What style of wine is Commanderia? If you're thinking it is a sun-dried, delicious, sweet nectar of a wine, you are 100% correct. It was first documented as early as 800 BCE, described by Hesiod in his sort of publication of essays and plays called Works and Days. It was rediscovered by Western Europeans when the Knights Templar invaded the island during the Crusades. So the name Commandaria, I believe it was called, what was it called before? I'll think of it. I can't remember right now, but it had a different name before Commandaria. But the name comes from the districts of commandaries that were established by the Crusaders during this time, during the time of the Crusades. In 1224, the poet Henry Dandeli recounted a global wine competition where the greatest wines from France, Spain, the Mosel, and Cyprus were pitted against each other. And of course, Commandaria won. And the modern wine industry has really found a lot of success with French grape varieties. But as we're seeing, the current generation of smaller wineries is focusing on the indigenous grapes. So they are different than what we find in like Israel and Lebanon that we've been talking about. Mavro, the most planted grape variety. I mean, um, sorry, sometimes I interrupt myself with my own thoughts, but the island, the culture here is very Greek in the majority of the island, right? The Republic of Cyprus, the part that's not controlled or occupied by Turkey, it's not part of Greece, but I would say that the culture itself is very Greek, right? So you can see sort of the names and maybe the style of winemaking to be very similar. So Mavro is known as black. It's the most planted grape on the island, but it really shows its best only in Commandaria. Xynisteri is the most planted white, but it has tremendous potential. It can have a lot of complexity and aging, of course, if it's handled well, lower yield, aged correctly. Its name translates to lacking acidity, which is kind of unfortunate because that's not at all a feature of this grape variety and typically this wine. So Mavro and Xynisteri are the two grapes that you will typically use for Commandaria. We also see white grapes like Primavera, Moro Canela, and then the reds are really gaining a lot of interest here. So Maracetico, which is a lighter red, it tends to be planted sort of interspersed, field blend style within the vineyard that needs a cross pollinator. So you usually find this as a blend. Pianodine, Lefkada, which is a very sort of tannic red grape variety. Because of this, you typically see Lefkada as a blend as well. And Ophthalmo as well, another red that you'll see in the island. Would it be common that you'll find these grape varieties on a label? I don't know. I'm wondering this myself. You know, we have the Xynisteri here, and you are seeing the grape variety. But if it's a blend, it might be more common that you might see, you know, red wine, depending on how much is in that blend, you know, red wine of the PGI. So we do have 7 actual PDOs. So we do have an appellation system that we can follow within Cyprus, but most producers do not. So, you know, how much do we know about Cyprus wines? Well, if you don't know a lot, probably seeing one of the 7 PDOs on the label will not be helpful for you, right? So Commandaria is the main one to know. It spans 14 villages in south central Cyprus. So it's the blue region that you see in Lemesos on the map here. And then down here you see they're putting out the grapes in the sun to dry for the Commandaria wine style. So you see the 2 styles of grapes, Mavro for the black, Xynisteri for the white. Typically, they'll dry for about 2 weeks. They're harvested from bush vines within the PDO. They have to be vinified within the appellation, but they can be aged outside of the region. 4 large companies have dominated the production for a long time throughout the 20th century. But we're really seeing as many places with things like Cinsault in Greece or Cinsault in Italy, right? We're seeing these smaller producers sort of reshaping the image of the wine. And there's really 2 divergent expressions. So non-vintage fortified wines that are composed primarily of Mavro. So Xynisteri is considered to be the higher quality grape variety for Commandaria. You know, probably fresher, brighter acidity, even though the grape name means lacking acidity, not true at all. That's one of those things you're like, was that like a game of telephone gone wrong, right? Like somebody maybe tried to whisper something like has a lot of acidity and somehow it turned into lacking acidity. Anyways, however these things happen, the vintage dated unfortified examples with the higher concentration and proportion of Xynisteri are what we're seeing from a lot of these smaller producers. And these are the higher quality examples that you'll find. The additional 6 PDOs that you see on the map here are almost completely unused. Most producers will favor one of the 4 PGI appellations. So you can see the PDOs are the colored blobs, right? And then this is the area that's occupied by Turkey. And then these are in the colored outline, the 4 PGIs. So we have Lemesos, which is where we're enjoying a wine from today. You have Lecosia, which is here in the north. You have Paphos, which is here in the west. And then the last one would be Lanaka or Naka over here, moving towards the east in the south as well. Turkey. This is the only country that I've been to out of all of the ones we're discussing today. I'd love to hear it if anybody's been to the Eastern Mediterranean. So a lot of land under vine here, a lot. Turkey is the world's 5th largest grape growing nation, but very little of this is actually for wine production. The majority of the grapes that are grown here are table grapes. So we see a lot of like Sultana and things like that within the area. We see Sultana vinified both like, so Venkat, yeah, that's a good, this producer, Tsiakkas, makes Commanderia. And then there's like, I think it's called Xynisteri St. John, I think. Let me double check that second one, but those are both producers of Commanderia. It's a good question. Let me write this down so I don't forget. Cool. So the indigenous grapes do have a lot of important genetic ties to the classic varieties of Western Europe. So a lot of people kind of surmise that the vine was actually first domesticated here in what would become Turkey as well. Of course, you know, when the Turks settled in the 11th century, they were newly converted to Islam, and this had a lot to do with how the history of the grapevine in so many places might have been disrupted over time, right? But we do have archaeological evidence of grape seed from as early as 9000 BCE. So this further supports claims of very, very early viticulture within the region. There are ancient occupants, the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Thracians, the Lydians, the Greeks, and the Byzantines all grew wine grapes. It was important to cultures in the late 19th century. Ottoman efforts for modernization coincided with the European phylloxera epidemic, so, and the construction of a railway. So during the French and the European phylloxera epidemic, a lot of Ottoman wines were actually exported out of Turkey and into Europe during this time as well. The Republic of Turkey, so this would have been, you know, the 1860s through the, I can't remember what year that the cure for phylloxera was found, but like the 1860s through the 1880s or so, right? In 1923, the Republic of Turkey is formed and the wine industry begins to enter a period of rebuilding. But there's really a focus on quantity that persisted until the 90s, when we start to see, again, the kind of smaller, conscientious producers that are emerging. We're seeing a lot of foreign consultants. Technological advancements have really propelled a new era of quality winemaking. So while we do in all of these Mediterranean countries, I think, you know, we think of these regions as being so incredibly ancient. It might be easy to think that the winemaking of these regions be the same way, but in most of these countries, we're really talking about a modern industry. We're talking about French oak. We're talking about stainless steel fermenters. We're talking about the top kind of quality that we can have in the winery for winemaking as well. However, we are also talking about a country where we are primarily Islamic in Turkey. So it's not like, you know, Israel is not, Lebanon is like 60% Islamic and then like 40% Christian. So it's almost, not quite, but almost an even split. But we do see a big kind of interference with the government of Turkey in the industry of the wine, in the industry of wine, and not necessarily in a good way as well. The local Turkish population that does drink is very loyal to their own wines. And this is also supported because Turkey has a very heavy import tax on foreign wines as well. So the grape varieties that are the producers, excuse me, not the producers, the consumers that do enjoy drinking wines in Turkey really do favor these international grape varieties. So we see a lot of domestically grown in Turkey, Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Sauvignon Blanc, Grenache, even Tempranillo can be quite popular in the area. But just like many of these other regions, less indigenous grapes. In Turkey, it's thought to be at more than 600 indigenous grape varieties. So again, the idea of this is so many of these grapes might be like, can you guys, am I going out or can you guys see me? Okay, good. It told me I had an unstable internet connection. All right, back at it. So really we have these 600 different grape varieties that are probably planted, a lot of them for table grapes, right? So we may not have producers that are making and growing grapes for the production of raisins or to go to the supermarket that are necessarily very interested in identifying these varieties, but it's thought to be at more than 600. This is also something that would support the idea of Turkey maybe being the birthplace of the grapevine as well, because you see this long history of grapes and then all of these kind of clones or indigenous varieties that lasted through these times, right? So for white grapes, the main are Emir. It tends to be like really fresh and easy to drink. You can see this for sparkling wines coming from Turkey as well. It can be really, kind of fresh and bright, high acidity. Narinth, we find primarily inland in Anatolia. Stone fruit, citrus, more blossoms. It has a little bit of a lighter body than something like Chardonnay. If it's grown at high altitude and picked with lots of acidity, it'll be almost, in a way, slightly Chablis-like. Misket is a very aromatic white grape used to produce dry and sweet styles. Misket's a grape that they oftentimes use. You might see it in the wines of Bulgaria, so just north of Turkey as well. For red, we have Okuzgozu, the bullseye. These are large berries, that's why it's called that. It's a little bit softer in a tannic structure, fruity, but still has elevated acidity. And I think, when we talk about, it's so funny, we talk all the time about global warming and how we can, kind of combat global warming with the grapes that we're planting in new vineyards. And in some places, the grapes have already evolved to live and work for the climate, right? So I think that's true for a lot of these Turkish grape varieties. Karasakis, also light-bodied, fruity red, again, really great acidity. It's grown near the coast by the ancient ruins of the city of Troy. Bogaskeri, which means translates to the throat burner or the throat puckerer, because it's both highly tannic and highly acidic. So you see this in the southeastern Anatolia. You can find premium oak aged versions, and especially when they're coming from old vines within the region, they really age extremely gracefully. So you might be able to recall something almost like a Barolo or a Barbaresco with the grape itself. And a couple of these are supposed to have some accents that my computer won't produce. So I apologize if anybody speaks Turkish and you're thinking that it's spelled wrong. So like some of these other areas we're talking about, Turkey did not have an official appellation system. So they're usually identified by the name of the zone of which they're grown. So the main areas are the Aegean coast. This is home to more than half the production. So this kind of teal color that you see located closer to the coast here. As we move inland, of course, we can get up to higher. The climate inland can be slightly more continental than you'll find on the Mediterranean coast. It gives us a range of both the native and international grape varieties that are really nice because they, just like a lot of Mediterranean, like Western European Mediterranean climate, right? Like the Southern Rhone, Corsica, Provence, we have these wines that develop a lot of really vibrant fruit flavor, but they're not overly jammy. So we get a lot of that at the Aegean coast. Marmara, just outside of Istanbul. Istanbul would be right here, this little cusp on the Bosphorus Strait. You can be on the European continent or on the Asian continent. And when I was there, people kept saying, oh, on the Asian side, on the Asian side. And I was like, what's the Asian? Is that like Chinatown or something? And then when I was saying this out loud, it hit me. And I was like, oh my gosh, they're talking about the continent, Amber. Come on. I was like, okay, the European and the Asian continent. That makes a lot of sense, like right here on the cusp, because Istanbul is on both sides. So Marmara is located nearby Istanbul. You see it on both sides here. So on the Marmara Sea, which we have here, and then a little bit further inland as well. We also have quite a few producers located in these areas, surrounded by water, but the vineyards can be continental in influence, also again because of some of the altitude that we see in the area. Kirklarelli is the coolest subregion. The vineyards are at higher altitudes. And then we also have the island of Bozkada. We see a lot of bush vines, some of the most traditional viticulture that we see within Turkey. And this is like, because the region is so close to Istanbul, if you were looking to experiment with the grapevine, this would be a great region. So I know that they do some really fantastic Nerines out of this area, this sort of Chardonnay-like white grape variety that you see as well. Anatolia, this is very broad because Anatolia is the central and then the eastern area of Turkey, as you can see on the map. So it includes kind of the central areas of Anatolia, the southeast, and the eastern areas of Anatolia. So these are a little bit more specific in terms of some of the grape varieties that still grow. But you can imagine, of course, that because the regions are so spread out, the grape varieties that they do best with are quite different. What can I tell you? So the southeastern zone, this is definitely a little bit warmer, hotter summers within this climate as well. We have in the eastern area, certainly some higher elevation vineyards as well, which do really well. This is really great for okugozu, that sort of light, fresh, fruity, high acid red grape that you'll see in this area. And then of course you have the regions near Cappadocia, which if you've ever been to Turkey, is the kind of beautiful area with all of the hundreds and hundreds of caves and hot air balloons that fly all over the place, but a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Really, really beautiful, fascinating area. And I think there was a picture here. So these are bush-trained vineyards in Cappadocia. So you have these formations that you just built, that ancient civilization just built into and lived in, these kind of cave dwellings. Really something else. It's been a long time since I've been there, so I wish I could remember a little bit more about the history, but. All right. I have never finished the class on time, and I'm really excited about this. All right, so sorry, they have the slide backwards. So Tsiakkas, we're talking about the Xynisteri. So this is coming from Lemesos. So just as we kind of mentioned before, this is the indigenous white grape variety, one of the most planted white that we see. It is the main grape variety that you see in the production of high quality Commendaria wines, right? So this one is declassified to the PGI, which is Lemesos on Cyprus. Comes from Pelendri village, and this is the winery that was started in 1988 on the Tourelles Mountains. So the Tourelles Mountains is where you find the majority of the production of Commendaria as well. You can see these beautiful vineyards that are sort of trained along the mountainside as well here. The winery was founded by Kostas and Marina Tsiakkas. Kostas' grandfather was a winemaker and one of the major negotiants in Pelendri, but his father wanted nothing to do with wine. He didn't want to go into the wine industry. So Kostas initially thought he would work in finance. He thought he would work for a bank. He got an MBA from UCLA, and then decided that he didn't want to do that. So he decided to go back to his hometown, Pelendri, and he decided to open this winery, sort of an homage to his grandfather and his family's history as well. When he started the winery, there were really very, very few international grape varieties. although he does produce both Commandaria, and he produces a lot of the indigenous varieties that come from the island as well. He also produces international grapes. So you'll see Chardonnay and Sauvignon Blanc and Cabernet Sauvignon as well. So for this particular wine, the grapes do sit with the skin for 2 days. And I'd love to find out more about the grape itself, because the wine is so incredibly light in terms of its color. It doesn't seem like it takes a lot of like orange contact from the skin itself as well. And down here you can see this is the Commandaria. So Commandaria that they produce, and you can see the kind of deep raisinated oxidative color that you get from those grapes being dried in the sun. This is I think a really special wine. So Domaine de Tourelles, you might remember from when we were talking about Lebanon as well. This was founded by a French adventurer, Francois Eugene Brune, in 1868. So it's really one of the longest established, most highly acclaimed wineries in the Bekaa Valley and in Lebanon as well. So one of those 4 wineries that existed at the start of the Lebanese Civil War during 1975. The winery was in the Brune family for a very, very long time. It was only within the last few decades actually purchased by Fawzi Issa, and he is a family member of the wife of Francois, of the Lebanese wife of Francois Eugene Brune. So it is sort of not quite directly, but it is still in the family that purchased it as well. Fawzi worked for René Rostaing in Côte Rôtie, I think one of the best producers of Côte Rôtie. He worked for Chateau Margaux in Bordeaux. These are old vines, 50 years, Cinsault. Cinsault is a grape variety, a Rhone grape that was kind of ignored, also thought as more of one of the workhorse grapes, sort of like Carignan in Lebanon, and is really seeing a resurgence among these producers. Dry farmed, hand harvested, indigenous yeast, all of the things that you want in one of your wines, right? I haven't opened this tonight because I just wasn't, I didn't want to waste the wines on maybe not being able to enjoy the expression of them as much as I might otherwise if I was feeling better. But I know when I've had this wine before, it is so impactful in terms of its palate weight, its flavor, its body. It's one of those wines that you taste so much fruit in it, things like currant and fig and a little bit of plum in this wine. And then you have this beautiful earth component to it, that's kind of like potting soil, and then these beautiful kind of dried herbal characteristics, sort of juniper, really beautiful, beautiful character to it. I love this wine too because it's not overly tannic on the palate. So it's something that you can really still enjoy with a lot of the sort of Mediterranean, Lebanese, Israeli, Cyprus, Turkish styles of food. We have a huge bounty of produce in this end of the Mediterranean and really all over the Mediterranean, right? And the metse, of course, are so incredibly important to this region when we talk about all these incredibly flavorful and spiced small plates that you see, hummus and baba ganoush and stuffed eggplants and olives and dolmas and, let's just keep going, little tahini, dips with pomegranate seeds, salads, fish, all of these beautiful dishes that you put on the table and you enjoy with a bottle of wine. And then as you can see, of course, we're going to finish off the meal with some arak as well, a little bit of water, a little bit of arak, and a lot of fun. Thanks, guys. What a tour of the Eastern Mediterranean. Bekaa, I wrote down your question so I can get back to you and make sure that we're finding out the correct answers for those.
Sure, thanks, Amber.
Of course. Any other questions?
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great night. See you soon.
Thanks.